"Why did my son ask for you by name?" the Commandant said. "Out of everyone in this facility, why you?" Elian Voss, not the Voss on the blacklist, a different one entirely, stood at attention in a room that smelled of cold metal and old authority, and tried to find a version of the truth that would survive the next 60 seconds. He did not find one fast enough. "Your son and I spent 4 hours together in the emergency shelter during the lockdown," he said. "That is the honest answer. I understand it doesn't sound like much." Commandant Rael Sovarn of the Draveki Unified Fleet looked at him the way a person looks at a structural calculation that has returned an impossible result. Not disbelieving, exactly, but unwilling to accept the number until she had checked every step. Her son was 6 years old by human equivalent reckoning. He was sitting in the chair beside her desk, holding a small model of a Draveki scout cruiser, and watching Elian with the calm certainty of a child who has already decided how everything is going to turn out. "He hasn't spoken voluntarily to anyone outside immediate family in 8 months, Sovarn said. "I know," Elian said. "He told me." The Commandant went very still. It had started, as these things often do, with a malfunction. Elian Voss was a third-grade environmental systems technician assigned to Outpost Drevna, a joint human Draveki research station positioned at the edge of the Kethera system. His work was not complicated and was not supposed to be. He monitored atmospheric processors, ran diagnostic cycles on the thermal regulators, and submitted reports that were read by exactly no one with any meaningful authority. His supervisor described him, in a quarterly evaluation Elian was not supposed to have read, as competent, unobtrusive, unlikely to advance. He had been there 11 months. The Draveki were not warm to humans on the whole. Not hostile. The alliance had been holding for 30 years and showed no sign of breaking, but distant in the way that people are distant when they are politely tolerating a presence they had not originally asked for. The outpost Draveki staff were scientists mostly, researchers, people who cared deeply about specific atmospheric phenomena and cared very little about the junior human technician who made sure their air stayed breathable. They were not unkind, they simply did not notice him. Elian had made a kind of peace with being unnoticed. He was good at it, actually. He had grown up the middle child in a family of people who filled rooms, and had learned early that the alternative to commanding attention was developing the ability to observe it from a comfortable distance. He noticed things. He remembered them. He filed them away. He noticed, for instance, that the Commandant's son arrived at the outpost on a Thursday, approximately 6 weeks into his 11th month there. The boy's name was Tovan. He was small even by Draveki standards, with the pale silver-gray coloring of the northern caste and eyes that were nearly translucent. A genetic trait that Elian understood from his orientation materials was considered significant in Draveki culture, though the materials had been frustratingly vague about why. He arrived with a handler, a senior aide to the Commandant named Sevik, who explained to the receiving staff that the boy would be staying for approximately 3 weeks, while family matters were resolved on the homeworld. What family matters? No one said. Tovan himself said nothing at all. Sevik mentioned this to the staff supervisor as a kind of warning. The boy did not speak to strangers. He had not spoken to strangers in some time. He was not to be pressured, engaged, or treated as a subject of curiosity. He was to be given space. He would be fine. He simply needed space. Elian had not planned to interact with the boy at all. He was a technician. The boy was the Commandant's son. These were two categories of person who had no logical reason to occupy the same space. The malfunction changed this. On Tovan's 5th day at the outpost, a fault cascade in the Eastern Wing's environmental grid triggered the station's emergency lockdown protocol. This was a precautionary measure, not a genuine crisis. The Draveki engineering team estimated a 2 to 4 hour repair window. Staff were routed to their designated shelter points. Elian's shelter point was E7, a room the size of a large closet that contained 3 emergency supply lockers, 2 bench seats bolted to the wall, a functioning air recycler, and 1 small Draveki child sitting on the floor with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on the door. Tovan was in E7 because it was the nearest shelter point to the observation deck where Sevik had taken him that morning. Sevik was not in E7 because the lockdown had caught him on the wrong side of the blast door. The boy looked at Elian when he entered. Elian looked at the boy. He sat down on the floor because the bench seats were uncomfortable, and also because sitting on the floor puts you at eye level with a child without requiring anything of them. This was something he had learned from his youngest sister, who had gone through a phase at age 4 of refusing to speak to any adult who was standing up. He did not say anything. He pulled his diagnostic tablet from his kit bag and ran the environmental check he had been in the middle of when the alarm triggered. The air recycler in E7 was functioning at 94% efficiency, which was fine. The thermal output was nominal. There was nothing wrong with the room. Tovin watched him do this. After approximately 8 minutes, Tovin said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, and directed not at Elian but at the general middle distance, "What are you doing?" "Checking the air," Elian said without looking up. A pause. "Is something wrong with it?" "No, I check it anyway. The air doesn't know it's fine until someone tells it." This was not a technically accurate statement. Elian was aware of this. He had said it on instinct, the way you say slightly absurd things to children, because slightly absurd things are often more interesting than accurate ones. Tovin considered this for a moment. "The air can't hear you," the boy said. "Probably not," Elian agreed. "But it hasn't complained yet, so I assume the system works." Something shifted in Tovin's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the precursor to one, a kind of provisional relaxation around the eyes. Elian returned to his tablet. That was the beginning. Over the next 3.5 hours, Tovin did not say a great deal, but he said more than he had said to anyone in 8 months, which Elian would not learn until later, and which he therefore did not treat as significant at the time. He simply responded when the boy spoke, and did not require anything in return. Tovin asked what the different readings on the diagnostic tablet meant. Elian explained them, using words that a 6-year-old could follow without condescension, because there is a difference between simplifying and talking down, and children always know which one you are doing. Tovin told him that environmental systems were boring. Elian said that was a reasonable position, but that boring systems were usually the ones that mattered, because nobody complained about the air until it stopped working. Tovin thought about this for a while, and then said that this was probably true of a lot of things. Elian said he thought so too. At some point, Elian was not certain when, Tovin moved from the floor near the door to the floor approximately 4 feet closer, which is a very specific distance that children maintain when they have decided you are probably safe, but are not yet prepared to fully commit to this opinion. Elian did not acknowledge the movement. He had younger siblings. He knew the rules. At hour 2 said without particular lead-up, "My father died." Elian was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "He was sick for a long time. Sevik says I should be used to it." "Sevik is wrong about that," Elian said, simply and without inflection, as a statement of fact rather than a judgment. Tovin looked at him. "Adults usually agree with Sevik," he said. "I'm not arguing with Sevik," Elian said. "I'm telling you that grief doesn't work on a schedule. There's no use to it. There's only through it, and that takes as long as it takes." Tovin was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "You talk differently than the others." "I'm a technician," Elian said. "We mostly talk to equipment. Equipment doesn't respond well to being managed." This time, the thing around Tovin's eyes completed itself into an actual expression. Not a full smile, but a specific softening that Elian recognized as the Dravecki equivalent of one. He had read this in his cultural orientation materials, and had not been certain he believed it until he saw it in person. He filed it away. At hour 3, the thermal regulator ran a self-diagnostic cycle that produced a brief harmonic tone, not alarming, just the resonance of cooling metal contracting against its housing. It was the kind of sound Elian had stopped registering months ago. Tovin flinched at it. Elian did not say anything about the flint. He said, "The regulators do that when they calibrate. It sounds wrong, but it means everything is working the way it should." He paused. "Like a ship settling after a hard burn. The noise means the hull is okay." Tovin looked at the ceiling, where the regulator housing was mounted. "Like it's breathing," he said. "Exactly like that," Elian said. Tovin nodded, slowly, the way children nod when something has settled something else inside them that they didn't have a word for. Then he leaned back against the wall, and approximately 12 minutes later, fell asleep, with his shoulder pressed against Elian's arm. Elian did not move. He ran 3 more diagnostic cycles, submitted his emergency status report through the shelter terminal, and read through 2 months of maintenance backlog he had been putting off. Tovin slept for 40 minutes. When the all-clear signal came through and the blast doors released, Tovin woke up with the disorientation of someone surprised to have slept at all. Looked at Elian for a moment, and then stood up and straightened his clothes with the deliberate composure of a child who had decided this had not happened in any way that required acknowledgement. Sevik was waiting outside the door, visibly relieved and visibly uncertain how to respond to the tableau in front of him. Tovin walked past him without comment. At the door he stopped. Without turning around he said, "The air was fine." "It usually is," Elian said. Tovin walked on. Sevik looked at Elian with an expression Elian could not fully interpret. Then he followed the boy. Elian went back to work. He assumed this would be the end of it. He was wrong. The next morning, Tovin appeared at the entrance to the Environmental Systems Monitoring Room at 0900, stood in the doorway for approximately 30 seconds, and then walked in and sat down in the secondary chair without asking permission. Elian looked up from his workstation. Tovin looked at the displays. The recycler in the east wing is running at 91%, Tovin said. Elian looked at his readings. You can read these? You explained them yesterday. This was true. Elian had explained them once briefly to a 6-year-old who had appeared to be mostly listening to something else at the time. 91% is fine, Elian said. The threshold for concern is 85. Tovin appeared to file this away. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not talk constantly. He watched. He asked occasional questions that were more precise than questions from 6-year-olds typically were, and he listened to the answers with a focus that suggested he intended to retain them. Sevik came to collect him at 11 and visibly did not know what to do with what he was seeing. This continued for 9 days. The outpost staff noticed. Of course they noticed. Outpost Drevna was home to approximately 230 personnel, and on a station of that size, a commandant's son voluntarily spending his mornings in the environmental monitoring room with a grade 3 technician was the kind of thing that generated significant commentary. Most of the commentary was the variety that people have when they are uncertain whether to be amused or concerned. The Dravecki researchers found it, as a group, baffling. The human staff found it charming in a way they were carefully not saying aloud. Sevik found it professionally worrying and personally confusing, and said neither of these things to Elian directly, though he communicated both through the specific quality of his silence whenever he arrived to collect Tovin. Elian found it personally something he did not have a precise word for. He had not set out to become important to anyone here. He had been posted to an outpost at the edge of a system where nobody knew his name, specifically because he was good at not mattering to people, and had generally found this comfortable. But children do not consult your preferences when they decide you are worth something. Tovin had decided with the serene pragmatism of someone who has learned that trust is a limited resource and should be spent carefully, that Elian was one of the people in whom it was worth investing. Elian took this seriously. He did not know how not to. On the 4th day, Tovin brought the model scout cruiser, the same one he would be holding in the commandant's office weeks later, and showed Elian where the engineering on the forward nacelles differed from the actual vessel specs. He knew the actual vessel specs. He had apparently memorized them at some point for reasons that he did not explain, and that Elian did not ask about. Elian told him that the model manufacturer had probably simplified the nacelle geometry for cost reasons. Tovin said that was dishonest. Elian said that was probably true, but that simplification and dishonesty were not always the same thing, and that sometimes the shape of a thing mattered less than what it was trying to represent. Tovin considered this for an unusually long time. Then he said, "My mother simplifies things when she briefs the council." "That's different," Elian said. "She's managing information for a specific purpose. Your model is just cheaper to produce." "How is that different?" "Intent," Elian said, "and whether the person being simplified to actually needs the full version." Tovin's expression did something complicated. "She simplified what she told me about my father," he said, "when he was sick." Elian set down the component he was holding. "Did you figure out the full version eventually?" "Yes." "Was it worse than the simplified version?" A pause. "Different, not worse." Elian nodded. "That's usually how it goes." Tovin picked up the model and turned it over in his hands. "She was trying to protect me," he said. It was not a question, but it had the weight of something that had been a question for a long time and had only recently found its answer. "Probably," Elian said. "Parents usually are when they get the simplification wrong. It doesn't mean the instinct was wrong, just the execution." Tovin did not respond to this, but something in his posture changed. A kind of settling, a tension released that Elian had not noticed was there until it was gone. He filed it away. The Commandant arrived at Outpost Drevna on a Tuesday 3 weeks to the day after Tovin, with no advance notice to anyone below senior staff grade, and an entourage of 8 that moved through the corridors with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this very often and were very good at it. Elian learned of her arrival the way most Grade 3 technicians learned of senior command arrivals. After the fact, from the reaction of the people around him. He was in the middle of replacing a flow sensor in the North Corridor junction when Sevik appeared at his shoulder and said, in a voice that was carefully calibrated to convey information, The Commandant has arrived and has requested a briefing on her son's activities during his stay. Your name came up. Elian finished securing the sensor, he asked. Because Tovin told her about you, Sevik said. At length, Elian repeated. He spoke to her more in the first hour of her arrival than he has spoken to anyone in the past 8 months, Sevik said. There was something in his voice that Elian could not entirely parse, not accusation but something adjacent to it. Bewilderment maybe, careful gratitude. She would like to understand how that happened. Elian packed up his toolkit. That, he said, is going to be a long conversation. Standing in Commandant Sovarn's temporary office with the cold metal smell and the weight of her attention pressing down on the room, Elian told her everything from the beginning. The emergency shelter, the floor, the air recycler diagnostic, the thermal hum that sounded like breathing, the model scout cruiser with the inaccurate nacelles, the mornings in the monitoring room, the conversation about simplification and intent, and a father who had died while his son was being managed rather than grieved with. Sovarn listened to all of it without interrupting. She was not what he had expected. This was the Commandant of the Unified Fleet's 3rd Sector, a woman who had spent 30 years navigating alliance politics and military command, and the specific variety of loneliness that comes with being the most powerful person in every room. Her file, which Elian had absolutely not read because Grade 3 technicians had no access to Commandant files, would presumably have conveyed someone formidable, controlled, armored. She was all of those things. She was also, very clearly, tired, not the operational tiredness of someone who needed sleep. The structural tiredness of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had made their peace with never setting it down. Tovin's father had been ill for 4 years, Elian understood. He had died 7 months ago. The Commandant had managed the death with the same precision she managed everything else, because she was Commandant Rael Sovarn, and that was what she did. She had simplified it for Tovin. She had managed the grief into something logistically survivable and had not noticed or had not allowed herself to notice that her son had responded by simply stopping. Stopping talking. Stopping engaging. Pulling into a distance that no one on her staff had been able to cross, because everyone on her staff was trained to take their cues from her, and her cues were, we are managing this, we are fine, we are moving forward. She had not been wrong, exactly. She had been alone in a specific way that high-functioning people are very good at sustaining until something breaks. When Elian finished, Sovarn was quiet for a long time. Tovin was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read a room very precisely, and was reading this one now with everything he had. He asked for you by name, Sovarn said finally. When I arrived, before I asked anything, he said there was a technician named Voss who needed to understand that the recycler in the East Wing was down to 88%. And would need attention before Friday. Elian processed this. He was right, he said. I was planning to run the maintenance cycle Thursday. Something crossed Sovarn's face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. Her eyes moved to her son, who was still watching her, and then back to Elian, and in that look there was a calculation running that Elian recognized because he had seen it before in a different face. The look of someone who has been shown something they did not plan for, and is trying to decide how to file it. He said the technician talked to the equipment, she said. It was a small joke, Elian said. To make the diagnostic process feel less, he said. Sovarn continued, in a tone that had softened by some degree he couldn't quite quantify, that the technician was the only adult who told him grief didn't work on a schedule. A pause. He quoted you directly, which means he retained it. Tovin retains things he considers important. The room was very quiet. Tovin set the model cruiser down on the edge of the desk and looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has organized the relevant pieces and is now simply waiting for the adults to complete the arrangement. He sounds like a scientist, Elian said. The way he processes information. His father was a scientist, Sovarn said. The words were careful, measured, but they cost something. He could hear it. He spent more time in his father's lab than anywhere else before the illness. After she stopped, began again. He stopped going into the lab. He might be ready to start again, Elian said. He was telling me yesterday about the variance in Ketharan atmospheric particulate density and why the current sensor array isn't calibrated for it correctly. Sovarn looked at him. He told you that. He also said the model in the monitoring room is 3 years out of date and someone should fix it. He seemed personally offended. Tovin, across the room, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but had the same structural shape as one. Sovarn looked at her son. Tovin looked at his mother. Between them, something shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, but unmistakably. A wall that had been very carefully built and very carefully maintained, developing in that moment a door. "You will join us for dinner," Sovereign said. It was directed at Elian. It was not, in any grammatical sense, a question. Tovin picked up the model cruiser. He walked across the room, which was not a long distance, but was, in context, a significant one, and stood beside his mother's chair. He held the cruiser out. "The nacelles are wrong," he told her. Voss explained why. Savarn looked at the cruiser, then at her son, then at Elian. "Then perhaps," she said, "he could explain it to both of us." Dinner became a habit before anyone decided to make it one. This was how it usually worked. Elian was learning. Not a decision, not a transition, not a moment where anyone said this is a different thing now. Just a series of small events that accumulated, became something else. He ate with them the first night because he had been invited, and declining the Commandant's dinner invitation was not something Grade 3 technicians did. He ate with them the second night because Tovin had found an inconsistency in the outpost's historical atmospheric records and wanted to discuss it, and the discussion ran past meal times. He ate with them the third night because Sovereign had asked him, very casually and not particularly like a commanding officer, whether he preferred Draveki tea or the human variety, and this question had felt oddly significant and he had not been able to explain why. He learned things. He learned that Sovarn drank her tea long past the point of warmth, which was exactly the kind of thing she would never have been observed doing in a room full of her officers. He learned that she had a habit of going still when she was processing something complex. Not the controlled stillness of command, but a private one, the stillness of someone who does their real thinking in silence and has very few places to do it. He learned that she had been stationed at this system's edge as a tactical assignment, a posting that her superiors considered a soft sanction for a political decision she had made 6 months ago, that everyone in the fleet acknowledged was correct, and that she had been informally punished for making anyway. She mentioned this once, without self-pity, as context for a larger point about bureaucratic incentive structures, and Elian had understood that she was telling him something real because she had very few people she could tell real things to. He learned that she laughed, actually laughed, when surprised by something genuinely funny, not the polite acknowledgement of humor that senior officers deploy in official contexts, but the involuntary kind, the kind that happens before the person can decide how they want to present it. The first time this happened, she looked briefly startled by herself. The second time, she tried to recover quickly. The third time, she did not bother. He filed all of it away. Tovin, meanwhile, was doing what Tovin did, observing, filing, and occasionally deploying conclusions he had reached some time ago, as if they were entirely new thoughts. One evening, approximately 2 weeks into the dinner habit, Tovin said, while examining a star chart on the monitoring room display, "My mother is different when you are here." Elian looked up from his workstation. "Different how?" "More like herself," Tovin said. He said this as if it were a technical observation about atmospheric density, precise, neutral, based on data. "She is usually Commandant Sovarn here. When you are at dinner, she is sometimes just Mother." Elian did not have a response to this that was appropriate to say to a 6-year-old. "She's carrying a lot," he said finally. "Yes," Tovin said. "She always has been. But she used to put it down sometimes." He turned to look at Elian with those nearly translucent eyes. "She stopped after Father died. I think she thought." He paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who has thought about this a great deal. "I think she thought that putting it down would mean falling apart. And she could not fall apart, because of me." The monitoring room was very quiet. "So you both," Elian said carefully, "were holding it together. For each other, with talking about it." Tovin looked back at the star chart. "Yes," he said. "It was inefficient." Elian made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It usually is," he said. 3 weeks after her arrival, on an evening when the Ketharan primary star was setting at an angle that turned the observation deck a shade of gold that didn't exist in Elian's reference points. "For what gold could look like," Sovereign said. "The recall order came through today." She was looking at the star, not at him. "You're being reassigned?" Elian asked. "Cleared, technically. The political situation that generated the posting has resolved. I have my choice of 3 stations." She paused. "Tovin and I will return to the homeworld within the week." The observation deck was quiet. Behind them, through the transparasteel, the outpost hummed its familiar frequencies. "That's good," Elian said. "Tovin will want access to his father's lab. He told you that?" "He told me he was going to correct the particulate sensor array calibration on this station." I told him that was ambitious for an outpost with one technician already behind on maintenance. He said he could do it faster if he had the right equipment. Alien paused. He knows what equipment he'd need. He's been thinking about it. Sovarn turned from the window. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding how to classify. Not unsure exactly, but working through implications. Alien, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. Something rearranged itself in the air between them. Something that had been careful and calibrated and professionally appropriate quietly decided it had held that shape long enough. I have spent 3 years, Sovarn said, running calculations on everything except the things that actually mattered. Because the things that actually mattered were the ones I could manage into safety. She stopped, started again. Toven is different these past weeks. Not repaired, there is no repaired, I understand that now. But moving, like someone who found a direction. Her voice was even, precise. But there was something beneath it that was neither of those things. He did not find that direction from me, Elian said. I just made it easier to walk. Don't, Sovarn said, with a small sound that was not quite humor and not quite something else. Don't deflect. You're very good at it, and I am telling you to stop. He stopped. She looked at him. I do not know, she said quietly, what to do with what this has been. I know what it is not. It is not protocol. It is not professionally uncomplicated. It is not what any version of this posting was supposed to be. No, Elian agreed. But Toven said my name again, she said. To me. Just Mother, not Commandant, not the formal address. He said it last week in the monitoring room when you were explaining the particulate calibration and he wanted me to pay attention. He just said it. Her voice was steady. It costs something to keep it that way. It has not been easy for 8 months. Elian did not say anything. Sovarn reached out. Not a command, not a gesture of authority. She touched the back of his hand, just that. A small and deliberate thing, the kind of thing that is enormous precisely because of how quietly it is done. I don't know how long the recalibration takes, she said. For all of us. As long as it takes, Elian said. That's all I've got. Something moved across her face, and it was not the Commandant's face. In that moment, it was Rails, just Rails, and she looked, for the first time since he had known her, like someone who had set something down. Then perhaps, she said, you should submit a transfer request, to whichever station we're assigned to. The fleet's not going to approve a Grade 3 technician transfer based on personal reasons, Elian said. They will, Sovarn said, if the Commandant requests it for operational continuity. Toven has identified 17 deficiencies in the standard atmospheric sensor array across 3 Draveki stations. Someone will need to supervise the corrections. Elian looked at her. That is, he said, an extremely specific justification. I am, she said with the first full smile he had seen from her, unhurried and unguarded, an extremely specific person. The transfer was approved in 6 days. The official documentation cited operational continuity and technical expertise in atmospheric systems management. Toven reviewed the paperwork with the thoroughness of someone who had understood from a very early age that the official documentation was always a simplification, and that the thing being simplified was usually more important. He did not say this. He filed it away. At the departure boarding, he stood beside his mother with the model cruiser under his arm and looked at Elian with the clear-eyed measurement of a child who has decided how the future is going to go and is simply verifying that the present is aligned with it. The East Wing Recycler, he said. Did you finish the maintenance cycle? Thursday, Elian said. Like I said. Toven nodded, satisfied. Then, with the economy of motion that characterized everything he did, he held out the model cruiser. Elian looked at it. The nacelles are wrong, Toven said, but it's still accurate enough to be useful. He said it the way Elian had once said something about air recyclers and schedules, as if it were a small and slightly absurd statement, and also as if it were not absurd at all, and also as if it meant something quite a lot larger than what was being said. Elian took the cruiser. I'll fix the nacelles, he said. I know, Toven said with absolute confidence, and turned aboard the transport. Sovarn was watching from 3 paces back. She did not say anything, she did not need to. Her expression said the thing that neither of them had put into official documentation. That the simplest version of what had happened here was a technician doing a maintenance check in an emergency shelter, and that the full version was something that would take years to understand completely, and that both versions were true simultaneously. She inclined her head, a small acknowledgement, precise, deliberate, and somehow exactly like a smile. Elian inclined his head in return. Then he followed them onto the transport, model cruiser in hand, and left behind an outpost that had never quite noticed him. heading toward a future that had been arranged by a 6-year-old with translucent eyes and a precise understanding of atmospheric particulate variance and the specific, non-negotiable logic of grief. Historians would later write extensively about the decade of joint human-Draviki research programs that Commandant Rael Sovarn implemented following her return to active senior command. They would credit her political acumen, her technical vision, her ability to build bridges across species and bureaucracy alike. They would not write about a grade 3 technician who sat on a shelter floor because it was the right height, or about a small boy who tested the air readings every morning and decided, on the basis of limited evidence and very sound instincts, that some people were worth keeping. But that was where it started, as most important things do.